On the outskirts of a small town called Sunnyfield, there was an old, abandoned stretch of road that hadn't seen much traffic in years. This place became known because of one particular resident, a German shepherd named Echo, who for 7 years stood guard on this very road, never straying from his post. Echo was once a celebrated member of the local police department, working alongside Officer Jake Reynolds. Their partnership was famous for its dedication and effectiveness in keeping the town safe. Tragedy struck 7 years ago when Jake was killed in the line of duty. The incident happened right on this road where Echo now stood vigil. His belief that Jake would one day return was unshakable. The folks of Sunnyfield knew this story, and for many, Echo became a symbol of loyalty and sorrow. They often passed by, leaving food and water, hoping he would accept their help, but Echo refused all offers. He was as much a part of that road as the asphalt itself, standing firm against time. Sunnyfield was a place where everyone knew each other, and Echo's story had become a local legend. Some thought he'd forgotten how to live without his partner, while others saw it as an act of eternal fidelity. But no one could make Echo leave. He stayed put, regardless of the weather, from snowstorms to the scorching heat of summer. One morning, as the sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, an old van rolled onto the road. Behind the wheel was Lena Martinez, a traveling artist. Lena was just passing through town, but after hearing Echo's story from a local at the gas station, she decided to stop. She wasn't like those who had tried to take Echo away from his place of mourning. Instead, Lena felt a deep need to understand his pain. Lena stepped out of her van, sketchbook and pencils in hand. She sat a respectful distance from Echo, not attempting to approach him, and began to draw. Her hands worked swiftly but with reverence for the moment, trying to capture the spirit of this dog waiting for the impossible. She left food and water but didn't try to draw Echo's attention to herself, understanding his heart was still with Jake. Days passed, and Lena continued to visit, sketching Echo at different times of day and in various weather conditions. She left her sketches near him as a silent tribute, hoping Echo might see his soul reflected in them. Sometimes she read aloud, sharing stories of loss and hope she encountered during her travels. Then, one evening as the sun set, casting long shadows across the land, something unexpected happened. Echo, who had never moved from his spot, took a few steps towards Lena. He didn't come close, but it was the first step toward a new beginning, the first sign that his heart might be ready for change. The days in Sunnyfield stretched on, each one blending into the next as Lena Martinez settled into a quiet routine. She'd park her van a little way down the road from Echo's spot every morning, unpack her art supplies, and sit in the stillness, sketching the German shepherd who'd become her silent companion. The townsfolk started noticing her too. Lena wasn't just another passerby trying to fix Echo or drag him away. She was different. She didn't push, didn't demand. She just stayed, letting Echo set the pace. Echo's amber eyes followed her movements sometimes, though he rarely budged from his post. His coat, once a glossy black and tan, was now dulled by years of dust and sun, but his posture remained proud, a soldier still on duty. Lena began to see him not just as a dog, but as a keeper of memory, a living testament to a bond that refused to fade. She'd lost people too, her younger brother to a car accident years back, and she recognized that look in Echo's eyes. Grief locked in time. One afternoon, as a warm breeze rustled the dry grass along the road, Lena decided to try something new. She pulled a small canvas from her van, along with some paints, and set up a few feet from Echo. "You don't have to move, partner," she said softly, her voice carrying a gentle southern lilt from her Georgia roots. "Just thought I'd bring some color out here for you." She dipped her brush into a deep blue and began painting the horizon behind him, letting the strokes flow freely. Echo tilted his head, his ears flicking slightly as if he registered her words. It was a small gesture, but to Lena, it felt like progress. She kept talking as she worked, her voice steady and calm. "Used to paint with my brother," she said. "He'd always tell me I was wasting time, but then he'd sit there watching me for hours. Funny how that works." She didn't expect Echo to understand, but speaking to him felt right. like she was honoring his presence, not just filling the silence. Word spread through Sunnyfield about the artist and the dog. A local diner owner, Miss Carla, stopped by one day with a thermos of coffee and a couple of biscuits. "You're a patient one, ain't ya?" she said, handing Lena the coffee. "Most folks gave up on that dog years ago." Lena smiled, brushing a strand of dark hair from her face. "He's not ready to give up, so I'm not either." Carla glanced at Echo, who sat statue still, then back at Lena. "Well, bless your heart, girl. You're something else." That evening, as the sky turned a fiery orange, Lena finished her painting. It wasn't just Echo. She'd added a faint outline of a man beside him, wearing a police uniform, his figure blurred like a memory. She set the canvas near Echo's spot, propped against a rock, and stepped back. "That's for you," she whispered. "Whoever he was, he's still with you." For the first time in days, Echo stood. Not fully, just enough to shift his weight and lower his head toward the painting. His nose twitched as he sniffed the air. Then he settled back down, closer to the canvas than before. Lena's breath caught in her chest. It wasn't much, but it was a crack in the wall he'd built around himself. She didn't say anything else, just packed up her things and sat in her van, watching him from a distance as the stars began to peek out. Across the road, an old farmer named Hank had been leaning against his pickup, watching the scene unfold. He'd known Jake Reynolds well, worked with him on a couple of community cases back in the day. Hank ambled over to Lena's van, his boots crunching on the gravel. "You got a gift, miss?" he said, tipping his worn baseball cap. "Ain't nobody got through to that dog like that. Not in 7 years." Lena looked out at Echo, now lying near her painting, his eyes half closed. "I'm not trying to get through," she said quietly. "Just trying to sit with him a while." Hank nodded, a slow, understanding nod. "Well, you keep sittin'. Might be he's waitin' for someone like you." As night fell, Lena made a decision. She wasn't leaving Sunnyfield, not yet. Something about Echo, about this road, had hooked her. She didn't know where it would lead, but for now she'd stay. And maybe, just maybe, Echo was starting to feel her there too. The weeks turned into a quiet rhythm along that stretch of road in Sunnyfield. Lena Martinez became a familiar sight, her van parked just off the shoulder, her easel or sketchbook always within reach. The townsfolk started calling her the Painter Lady, and some even swung by with small offerings: homemade cookies, a thermos of sweet tea, a blanket for the cooler evenings. They didn't say much, just nodded and left her to her work. But Lena wasn't there for them. She was there for Echo, the German shepherd who'd spent 7 years guarding a memory. Echo's spot hadn't changed much, but something in him had. He didn't move far, didn't abandon his post, but his eyes followed Lena more often now. When she painted or read aloud, his ears would twitch, catching the sound of her voice. She'd taken to leaving little things for him: bits of jerky, a tennis ball she'd found in her van, even a worn-out bandana she tied loosely to a stick near his spot. "Thought you might like some company," she'd say, never pushing him to take it. Sometimes he'd sniff the offerings, sometimes he'd ignore them, but he never chased her away. One crisp morning, with the air smelling of fallen leaves, Lena decided to switch things up. She pulled an old portable radio from her van and tuned it to a classic country station. Johnny Cash's low growl filling the silence. "My brother loved this stuff," she told Echo, setting the radio a few feet from him. "Figured you might too." She sat back with her sketchbook, drawing the lines of his face against the golden autumn light. Echo didn't react at first, but after a while, his head tilted slightly toward the music, his body easing into the ground. That's when Hank, the farmer, showed up again. He'd taken to checking in every few days, curious about the strange dance between the artist and the dog. "Well, I'll be," he said, scratching his gray stubble as he watched Echo. 7 years, and I ain't never seen him relax like that." Lena glanced up from her sketch, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Guess he's got good taste in music." Hank chuckled, then grew serious. "You know, Jake used to play the radio in his cruiser all the time. Old country just like that. Kept Echo calm on long shifts. Lena's pencil paused mid-stroke. She looked at Echo, then back at Hank. You think he remembers? Hank shrugged. Dogs like him? They remember everything. Jake was his whole world. The weight of that settled over Lena as she watched Echo. She'd been piecing together his story through the bits and pieces the townsfolk shared. Jake's death in a crash, Echo's refusal to leave the scene, the way the police had tried and failed to bring him in. But hearing about the radio hit different. It wasn't just loyalty keeping Echo here. It was love, etched into every muscle, every breath. That afternoon, Lena painted something new. Not just Echo this time, but the road itself. Highway 9, cracked and faded, stretching into the distance. She added the faint shape of a patrol car, its lights dim, and Echo sitting beside it, proud and alert. When she finished, she placed the painting near him like she had before. This is how I see you, she said quietly. Not stuck, just waiting. Echo stood again, slower this time, and nosed the canvas. He didn't lie down next to it like last time, but he didn't retreat either. Instead, he took a step toward Lena, just one, and sat, his gaze steady on her. Her heart skipped. It was the closest he'd ever come on his own. She didn't move, didn't speak, just let the moment hang there between them. Hank, still lingering nearby, let out a low whistle. Lord Almighty, girl, you're a miracle worker. Lena shook her head. Nah, he's the miracle. I'm just here. But inside, she felt it. A shift, small but real. Echo wasn't ready to leave the road. Not yet, but he was starting to let her in. As dusk fell, Lena packed up her things but left the radio playing softly. She climbed into her van and watched Echo through the window. He stayed where he was, closer to her spot than his usual one, the music humming faintly in the air. For the first time in 7 years, he didn't look quite so alone. And neither did she. The next morning, Lena woke to find something unexpected. The tennis ball she'd left days ago was now sitting a few feet from her van, scuffed with dirt like it had been moved. She looked at Echo, still in his spot, his eyes locked on her. You playing games with me now? She asked, half laughing. He didn't move, but his tail gave the tiniest flick. It wasn't much, but to Lena, it was everything. Fall deepened in Sunnyfield, the trees along Highway 9 shedding their leaves in a slow cascade of red and gold. Lena Martinez had been there for over a month now, her van a permanent fixture near Echo's spot. She hadn't planned on staying this long. Her life as a wandering artist usually kept her moving from town to town, but something about Echo, about this road, held her in place. The German Shepherd was still a sentinel of the past, but the cracks in his armor were starting to show. Lena had taken to spending her mornings sketching and her afternoons experimenting with ways to reach Echo. She'd leave small tokens, a stick of jerky, a squeaky toy she'd picked up at the dollar store, even a little pile of pine cones she'd stacked into a tower. Just something to keep you busy, she'd say with a grin, knowing he might not touch them. But lately, he'd been inspecting her gifts more often. The tennis ball incident had sparked something in her, a hope that Echo wasn't just tolerating her presence, but maybe, just maybe, engaging with it. One chilly afternoon, with a gray sky promising rain, Lena decided to up the ante. She pulled a beat-up folding chair from her van and set it up a few yards from Echo's spot, then grabbed an old blanket and draped it over the back. Getting cold out here, she called to him, patting the chair. You're welcome to it if you want. She didn't expect him to take it. 7 years of stubbornness didn't bend that easy, but she sat nearby anyway, sketching the chair with Echo in the background. The rain started an hour later, a light drizzle that turned the road into a slick, shiny ribbon. Lena stayed put, pulling her jacket tighter, her pencil moving across damp paper. Echo didn't flinch either, his fur matting slightly as the drops fell. She watched him through the haze, marveling at his resolve. You're tougher than me, partner, she muttered, shaking her head. That's when Miss Carla from the diner rolled up in her old Chevy, a plastic bag in hand. You're gonna catch your death out here, girl, she hollered, stepping out with an umbrella. She handed Lena a warm biscuit wrapped in foil. And this is for that fool dog if he'll take it. Lena smiled, peeling back the foil to reveal a piece of bacon tucked inside. Thanks, Carla. He's picky, but I'll try. Carla squinted at Echo, then at the chair. What's that for? Lena shrugged. Figured he might want a spot out of the wet. Probably won't use it, but it's there. Carla snorted. 7 years in the elements, and you think a chair's gonna sway him? You're a dreamer, Lena Martinez. But there was a warmth in her tone, a flicker of admiration. As Carla drove off, Lena tossed the bacon toward Echo. Not too close, just enough to tempt him. He sniffed the air, his nose twitching, but didn't budge. The rain picked up, drumming against the van's roof, and Lena sighed, ready to call it a day. She stood to pack up when she heard it, a soft shuffle of paws. She froze, turning slowly. Echo had moved. Not far, but he'd taken 2 steps toward the chair, his head low as he sniffed the bacon. Then, in a move that stopped Lena's breath, he climbed onto the chair, settling awkwardly on the blanket. His big frame dwarfed the flimsy metal, but he stayed, the bacon still untouched on the ground. Lena's mouth fell open. Well, I'll be damned, she whispered. She didn't dare move, didn't want to spook him. Echo sat there, rain dripping off his muzzle, staring out at the road like he was still on watch. But he was on the chair, her chair. It wasn't the road, wasn't his usual dirt patch. It was a shift, fragile but real. Lena grabbed her sketchbook, her hands trembling as she captured the moment. Echo, proud and soaked, claiming something new. The rain eased up as dusk fell, and Lena finally approached, slow and quiet. You look good up there, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Echo's ears flicked, but he didn't move. She left the bacon where it was and retreated to her van, watching him through the window. He stayed on the chair all night, the first time in 7 years he'd slept anywhere but his post. The next morning, Hank pulled up in his pickup, his jaw dropping when he saw Echo. Holy hell, girl, he said, climbing out. You got him off the ground? Lena nodded, still dazed. Didn't think he'd do it. Hank stared at the dog, then at her. Jake'd be proud, you know. That dog's been waitin' for someone to give him a reason. Looks like you're it. Lena didn't know what to say. She looked at Echo, still on the chair, his eyes calm but alert. For the first time, she wondered if he was waiting for her. Not Jake, not anymore. And maybe she'd been waiting for him too. Winter crept into Sunnyfield, wrapping Highway 9 in a blanket of frost. The air bit at Lena Martinez's fingertips as she worked, but she didn't mind. She'd been out there with Echo for months now, and the cold was just another part of their unspoken pact. The German Shepherd had changed in subtle ways. Still loyal to his spot, still watching the road, but he'd started using the chair Lena had left him more often. It sat there like a throne, worn and rusted, draped with that old blanket now stiff with dirt and weather. Lena had upgraded her setup too. She'd strung a tarp between her van and a nearby tree, creating a makeshift shelter where she could paint even when snow flurries dusted the ground. She'd taken to leaving a second blanket near Echo's chair, folded neatly, just in case he wanted it. Can't have you freezing out here, partner, she'd say, her breath puffing in the air. He never took it, but he'd sniff it sometimes, his nose brushing the fabric before he settled back down. The townsfolk had started treating Lena like one of their own. Miss Carla brought hot cocoa on the coldest days, and Hank swung by with firewood once, muttering something about not letting that crazy artist freeze her tail off. Even the local sheriff, Tom Grayson, stopped by one afternoon. He was a gruff man, nearing retirement, with a face carved by years of hard calls. Heard you're the one keepin' that dog company, he said, nodding toward Echo. Lena shrugged, brushing paint off her hands. Just passing the time with him. Tom studied Echo, who sat on his chair, eyes fixed on the horizon. Jake'd be glad someone's looking out for him. We tried to take him in after the crash. Damn near broke my heart when he wouldn't budge. Lena glanced at the sheriff. He's not ready to leave. Maybe he never will be. Tom nodded, a shadow crossing his face. Maybe, But he's got you now. That's something That night, the temperature plummeted, and a thin layer of snow coated the road. Lena stayed late, huddled under her tarp with a lantern, working on a new painting. This one was different. Echo in the foreground, his chair beneath him, but behind him, the road faded into a soft blur of white, like it was letting go. She didn't know why she painted it that way, but it felt right. When she finished, she set it near Echo's spot, whispering, "This one's for you, buddy." Echo stood, shaking snow from his fur, and nosed the canvas. Then, to Lena's shock, he grabbed the folded blanket in his jaws and dragged it onto the chair, settling down with it draped over his back. She laughed, a sharp sound in the quiet night. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" He didn't react, just rested his head on his paws, the blanket a makeshift shield against the cold. The next morning, Lena woke to an unexpected sight. Echo wasn't on the chair. He was lying just outside her tarp, closer to the van than he'd ever been. The blanket was still with him, tangled around his legs like he'd carried it over. Her heart thudded. "Mornin', partner," she said softly, stepping out. His ears flicked, and he lifted his head, meeting her gaze. For the first time, he didn't look away. Hank rolled up soon after, his truck crunching through the snow. "Well, I'll be a son of a gun," he said, spotting Echo. "He's pracked ly campin with you now." Lena grinned, pouring coffee from a thermos. "Guess he likes the neighborhood." Hank shook his head, marveling. 7 years, and you're the one he picks. Ain't that a thing?" Lena handed him a cup, her eyes on Echo. "Think he's ready for more?" Hank sipped his coffee, considering. "Maybe. Dogs like him, they don't forget, but they can learn to lean on somebody new. Jake'd want that for him." Lena nodded, the weight of that settling in. She'd been running from her own ghosts for years. Maybe Echo was showing her how to stop. That afternoon, she tried something bold. She patted the passenger seat of her van. "What do you say, Echo? Want to ride with me?" She didn't expect much. 7 years of staying put didn't vanish overnight, but she left the door open and waited. Echo stood, sniffed the air, then took a step toward the van. Then another. Lena held her breath as he paused, his front paws on the step, like he was testing it. He didn't climb in, not yet, but he didn't retreat either. He sat there, half in, half out, staring at her. "Take your time," she said, her voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere." And she meant it. For the first time in 7 years, Echo had a choice, and Lena was ready to wait as long as he needed. Winter tightened its grip on Sunnyfield, the snow piling up along Highway 9 in soft drifts. Lena Martinez had been out there with Echo for months now, her van a stubborn outpost against the cold. She'd lost track of how long she'd stayed. Her wandering artist life had always been about moving on, but Echo had anchored her here. The German Shepherd was still a guardian of the past, but he'd started to shift, inching closer to Lena in ways she never dared hope for after 7 years of solitude. Echo had taken to sleeping near her tarp most nights, the blanket she'd left him now a permanent part of his setup. He'd drag it from the chair to wherever he settled, a quiet claim on something new. Lena kept painting, her canvases piling up in the van. Each one a chapter of Echo's story, from the road to the chair to the moments he'd chosen her. She didn't know where it was all heading, but she felt it building, like a storm ready to break. One evening, with the sky heavy and gray, Lena decided it was time. She'd been patient, letting Echo come to her on his terms, but something in the air felt different. She opened the passenger door of her van and patted the seat again. "Come on, partner," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Let's take a ride. Just you and me." She didn't push, just stood there, the wind tugging at her jacket. Echo looked at her, his amber eyes sharp and searching. He'd hesitated before, testing the step but never committing. This time he stood slowly, shaking snow from his fur. Lena held her breath as he took one step, then another, his paws crunching against the frozen ground. Then, in a moment that felt like it stretched forever, he leapt, clean and sure, into the passenger seat. He sat there, tall and alert, like he'd done it 1,000 times before. Lena's heart pounded. Well, hot damn, she whispered, climbing into the driver's seat. She didn't start the engine right away, just let the silence settle between them. Echo didn't flinch, didn't jump out. He turned his head toward her, and for the first time in 7 years, his tail gave a slow, deliberate wag. She laughed, tears pricking her eyes. All right, buddy. Let's see where this takes us. She turned the key, and the van rumbled to life. They rolled down Highway 9. The road Echo had refused to leave stretching out behind them. Lena kept it slow, glancing at him every few seconds. He didn't panic, didn't tense. Just watched the world pass by, his ears twitching at the hum of the tires. After a few miles, she pulled off into a quiet clearing near a frozen creek, cutting the engine. Thought you might like a change of scenery, she said, opening his door. Echo jumped out, sniffing the ground, his movements sharp and precise like the K9 he'd once been. Lena followed, grabbing a thermos of coffee and the tennis ball from her stash. She tossed it lightly, not expecting much, but Echo lunged, fast and clean, catching it midair. He didn't bring it back, just stood there with it in his mouth, tail wagging again. Lena grinned. Still got it, huh? They stayed by the creek for hours, Echo exploring the snow while Lena sketched him against the stark white backdrop. When the sun dipped low, she called him back. Ready to head home, partner? He trotted over, climbing into the van without hesitation this time. Home wasn't the road anymore. It was wherever they were together. Back in Sunnyfield, they pulled up near the old spot, but Echo didn't rush to reclaim it. He stayed by the van, lying down near the tarp as Lena built a small fire. Hank rolled by later, his truck rumbling to a stop. Heard you took him for a spin, he said, eyeing Echo. Lena nodded, poking the fire. He's ready for more than I thought. Hank smiled, a rare softness in his weathered face. Jaked be tickled pink. That dog's got a new mission now, you. Lena looked at Echo, his eyes reflecting the flames. She'd been running from her own pain for years, painting over it with every mile. But here, with Echo, she'd found something solid. Guess we're both strays who stopped running, she said quietly. Hank tipped his cap and drove off, leaving them to the night. That spring, Lena and Echo left Sunnyfield. Not for good, but for a new road. She'd fixed up the van, and he rode shotgun now, his head out the window, ears flapping in the breeze. They'd come back to visit, to sit by Highway 9 and remember Jake. But for the first time in 7 years, Echo wasn't waiting. He was living with Lena, his partner, his home. And she'd never paint alone again.